I feel even more embarrassed now after that encomium from Brendan, but I'd just like to begin by thanking him and Simon and Duncan for arranging this event, which is really around the republication of Red Petrograd, and also a French edition appeared last year, which I said I would draw attention to. And it's rather flattering, of course, that a book that I was researching 40 years ago is still of some interest. At the same time, thinking about something one wrote 40 years ago invites all kinds of reflections about oneself, about the political situation in which one wrote it. And I thought that if you would bear with me before I talk broadly about mainly the factory committees and workers' control of production in 1917, I would just say a little bit about the context in which I wrote it. I'm sorry, I kind of lost my text, so this is adding to a late arrival and various other things, but I'm almost there. I'm not getting the text, but I thought it might be useful to this particular audience to say that this was a book that emerged very much out of a political engagement. I was for about 5 years intensively, and for another 2 years in a more oppositional way, a member of the International Socialists, which became the Socialist Workers' Party in 1977. And this was a period of intense class struggle in Britain. I went to Oxford as an undergraduate, but moved to Birmingham in 1973, so I missed the Battle of Saltley Gate, as it was called, when at least 20,000 engineers came out in support of the first national miners' strike. But I was there for the second miners' strike. I was very active in selling newspapers, leafleting, and so on. And it was out of that experience, in part, that I came to focus eventually on workers' control of production. I knew little about Marxism or the Russian Revolution before I went to Oxford, although I had at school been influenced by 1968 and by the movement against the Vietnam War. And so when I went to Oxford, I was determined to throw myself into some kind of revolutionary struggle, and I decided on the International Socialists because they had an orientation towards the labour movement. I came from a working class Yorkshire, Catholic, Irish kind of background, and was keen that I should join an organisation that had a serious orientation towards the labour movement. As I say, I knew very little about the Russian Revolution, or indeed about Marx, but I did have Russian, and it was partly out of political activity, but also out of a kind of rebellion against the then very, very conventional and dull history curriculum in Oxford that I... No, it's all right, it's fine. That I decided that I was going to do something that was in line with the interest at that time in history from below, thinking about the history of ordinary people, thinking about labour history, thinking too about how the Russian Revolution had gone terribly wrong, leading to Stalinist tyranny. I did have Russian, I'd done it at school, and so off I went to Birmingham in 1983. And I was very fortunate because I was supervised by a man called Moshe Lewin, or Misha Levine as we knew him, who was an inspirational gadfly of a social historian. He was anti-Stalinist. He wrote extensively on the Soviet peasantry from a kind of pro-peasant position, one that I now share, though I don't think I did at the time. And it was while I was there that, partly through politics, partly through interest in things that were happening in the wider historical world, like history workshop movement, or I spent some time briefly in Paris, and I was influenced by a libertarian Maoist organization that produced a journal called Les Révoltes Logiques, Logical Revolts. And it was through that kind of exposure to a kind of libertarian Marxism that I came on to the topic of workers' control. The Trotskyist left, of which the International Socialist was a sort of successor, I suppose, had shown very little interest in questions of the relationship of economic and political power. And this was a time when there was a beginning debate about the relationship of Bolshevik efforts at state-making with workers' power at the point of production. And there were beginning critiques, and I have to say some of them were quite heavily Maoist, which were trying to think about the classic dialectical relationship in Marxism between forces of production and relations of production. And I was very, very influenced by that. But as a libertarian Marxist, that was my own self-designation, notwithstanding this organization that was increasingly moving in a Leninist direction. I was always interested in libertarian critiques of Bolshevism. And a piece I read as soon as it came out was by a man called Maurice Brinton, called The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control. It had come out in 1970, just as I was going to university. And Brinton, who in another designation was a man called Chris Pallis, who was an extremely influential brain surgeon, but Brinton was the founder of a group called Solidarity in Britain, which was much influenced by the French anti-Stalinist organization called Socialisme ou Barbarie, socialism or barbarism. And in this book, Brinton put together a body of materials around the debates that took place after October between the Bolsheviks and the leaders of the factory councils in Petrograd. And he argued that the Bolsheviks, and Lenin in particular, had used the movement for workers' control as a means simply of consolidating their influence in the working class. And as soon as they come to power, they drop the slogan very peremptorily. Another very powerful piece that had an influence on me was a piece that appeared in Critique, the journal still going, one of the very few left journals that still continues. In Critique number 3, 1974, somebody called Chris Goody wrote an extraordinarily original piece that was bursting with ideas, not always correct, I think, but he challenged Brinton in a very robust way and said there was really no serious division between Lenin's views on workers' control and those of the leaders of the factory committees. And he made a powerful argument that the vision of the factory committees had always been one of centralizing workers' control into an apparatus to regulate the entire economy. And he suggested, and this was the first time I'd come across the idea, though now it's rather widespread, he suggested that Petrograd should be seen as one in a chain of munitions producing centres that stretched from Berlin and Vienna down to Turin, Milan, Italy, and up north to Glasgow. Movements that we might call in Britain the shop stewards movement or the Räte in Germany, or the sort of Gramsci factory councils of 1919 to 20. And he suggested that these were organizations dominated by skilled metal workers who were defending a certain privilege, privilege is not the right word, but a certain kind of position of some power within the relations of production at the point of production, and resisting the widespread importation of unskilled labour, often female labour, into the munitions factories. And this idea of workers' control perhaps as rooted in a struggle against what in the British context was called dilution. This again was a very powerful idea, though I remember even as a beginning graduate student, I knew that factory committees had emerged in Russia in the first revolution in 1905 to 1907, and they were called Sovieti Starost, and a starosta is an elder in the village. And so I was kind of intrigued to know just how far factory committees were indigenous institutions and how far they were, as Goody argued, part of an international chain of organizations that were fighting against the dilution of skill in the context of a massive expansion of war production. I went to Russia in 1976 to 77 with all these questions buzzing in my mind. Did the movement for workers' control in Russia have anything in common with, say, the British shop stewards movement? Had Bolsheviks ever been seriously committed to workers' control of production? Was the movement, as the few academic historians who'd studied it, I'm thinking particularly of Paul Average, but a man called Kaplan, was it essentially an anarcho-syndicalist movement that fundamentally had very little in common with the centralized vision of the Bolsheviks? How did factory committees and trade unions get on in 1917? Were the factory committees indeed bodies that excluded women and the unskilled and represented a kind of male worker privilege? And finally, and crucially, how did the vision of the factory committees after October converge with or differ from that of Lenin? But those were genuinely questions that were buzzing about in my mind, and had quite an open mind about this. I was pretty sure that Lenin was not as bad a guy as the libertarian Brinton said. I had kind of otherwise a desire to really try and look not at what the political leaders or even the factory committee leaders were saying, but looking at what was happening on the ground. And my hope was, a very forlorn hope as it turned out, that I might get into factory archives, that I might get into the archives of, say, city district Soviets in Petrograd. And much of the time that I spent a year in first Moscow and then in Leningrad, was looking at broader questions, the social characteristics of the Russian working class, its highly differentiated character, looking at the labour movement's history from really the end of the 19th century through to 1917, looking not only at factory committees, but at trade unions and local Soviets. But it's on the factory committees that I want to concentrate, and I'm just going to go through some of the issues and tell you both what conclusions I came to, but also reflect a little bit critically on some of that, partly in the light of my own political evolution maybe, but also partly in the light of material that wasn't available in the late 1970s, and which only came to light after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And the first thing that I wanted to do and seemed inevitable, a context for research specifically on factory committees, was to look at the dimensions of an economic crisis that started already in 1915 with food shortages that escalated in the course of the First World War into a crisis of transportation. But then by 1917, and particularly in Petrograd, much less so elsewhere, but particularly in Petrograd, led to rocketing inflation by the late summer and autumn of 1917 into major shortages of fuel and raw materials. And one of the things that struck me, and this is a particularity more of Petrograd than elsewhere, although it's true that by 1917 a very large proportion of the industrial workforce nationwide was involved in production for the war effort. But in Petrograd, something like 80%, maybe even 85% of industrial workers, not service workers and the like, but industrial workers, were employed in the sectors that were either directly producing munitions and weapons, or they were in ancillary industries that were tied to the war effort, such as making uniforms for soldiers, or beyond Petrograd, involved in mining and metallurgy. And the economic crisis became ever more important in the way that I was thinking about how this movement emerged. And one of the major arguments of the book is that the Factory Committee movement was fundamentally a response to economic crisis, driven by a belief that the existing organs of state regulation, and I may say a word about those if I get time in a moment, that they represented the interests of the capitalist class, who would seek to solve the economic crisis at the expense of the working class. And by autumn, as factory production began to grind to a halt as a result of shortages of fuel and raw materials, the idea was propagated in part by the Bolsheviks, in part by the Factory Committee leaders, that this was largely due to sabotage by the capitalist class. I didn't quite believe that, actually. I mean, I do think that there were instances of sabotage, but the idea that what in my mind was a structural crisis was due to the direct intentions of the capitalist class became very, very powerful. In this context, the factory committees began to implement what they called Controi, which in Russian is a slightly different word from our control. We do use it somewhat similarly to the Russian when we talk about things like passport control, but by and large we think about control as actual management of something, the power over something. And this was something that had appeared always in the anarcho-syndicalist literature, which said that the basic aims of this movement were ultimately for workers to take over the factories in which they worked. So a very direct form of control. But it's very clear, reading the documentation that emerged both at factory level and then within a Petrograd circuit of factory committees, which was formed first of all as a conference in May 1917, and then a central council of Petrograd factory committees was set up. And it was very clear from the literature that they were producing that this was control in the sense of overseeing, of monitoring, of seeing that things were not done which were against the interests of the workers. And so, especially in the privately owned sector, workers' control began in really quite modest ways. It was looking at checking, hiring and firing, keeping a general eye on management activities, demanding representation in decision making, and very gradually, as the economic situation deteriorated, it was about factory committees going out and trying to procure fuel in particular, but also sometimes food and raw materials. The second question that I think I made some contribution to answering, but it's one where now I think I would want to modify the answer I made in the book, related to Bolshevik leadership of the movement. The factory committees were largely Bolshevik, and the first city conference in May 1917 passed a Bolshevik resolution. And there's a passage in Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution where he says something like, it's about the Bolsheviks lagging behind the workers' movement. So the Bolsheviks were lagging behind the Soviets, but the Soviets were lagging behind the factory committees. And this seemed to me very plausible, and it certainly put paid to the idea that this movement was powered by anarchist or syndicalist visions. So there were anarcho-syndicalists within the movement, and sometimes quite prominent. But there were also left SRs, there were left Mensheviks, and others. At the same time, even then, and this is where I would now modify my view, I was aware that in the 4 volumes of Lenin's collected works, which cover the years 1917 to 18, there's only one mention of factory committees, and I read the conference minutes of the April conference of 1917, which took place after Lenin returned, and put forward the April theses, and then again the 6th Party Congress in August 1917, when Lenin was in hiding and Trotsky was in prison. And in neither of these conferences is there anything terribly positive said about workers' control. It's seen as a necessary element within a centralized and coordinated nationwide system of economic regulation. And just to sort of pinpoint the way in which our own, on the left, understanding of this period has kind of hidden certain things as well as brought other things to the fore. Much, much more was said, especially at the 6th Congress, about the need for compulsory labour conscription. In other words, every citizen would be required to work compulsorily, and in many cases workers would be redistributed, i.e. moved geographically in order to meet particular shortages or sectors of the economy where they were needed. And this adumbrates things we think about in the context of war communism, but this idea of centralism was very much there, and at the time I guess I passed over it. I now would want to make much more of that. At the same time, the stenographic reports of the conferences of the factory committees had always been, they were very rare, but they'd always been available, say, in London. They were in the British Library. And if one went to those, one saw very quickly that the basic idea of workers' control had come at the time of the February Revolution, and not at all from Bolsheviks, but from SRs and Mensheviks. And they talked openly about the need for democracy and collegiality in production, and they made a distinction that became very, very important in the subsequent movement between preliminary and managerial control. And they, I think now, but I didn't realize it at the time, were indeed skilled workers who felt that as a result of the overthrow of the autocracy, they had a right to be directly involved in workplace management. But I think also, for many of them, this was about trying to maintain production for the war. And so one Russian historian subsequent to my work went on to argue that had there not been economic crisis, what one might have seen out of this movement was a kind of co-partnership between labour and capital, something similar, say, to the West German model after 1945. As I say, that was definitely not to be, but it is a kind of interesting way of thinking about the conflicting potentialities of this movement. In spite of arguing that this was primarily a practical response to the threat to jobs and the threat to people's very existence. I was sure that this very early framing of the idea of workers' control was fundamentally about democracy and democracy in the workplace. And I came to the view that in many respects the critique of people like Brinton, less so the sort of Maoist critique that came from French economist Charles Bettelheim, but that their argument that the revolution had thrown up some possibility of thinking about how socialism should involve reconstructing power at the grassroots, including in the workplace, and that the state and the transformations of the economy at the point of production had to go on in tandem. And I think that in October, when the Bolsheviks, as one of their first acts, and arguably really the only socialist act, immediately start to discuss a decree on workers' control, that I think one sees quite quickly real divisions between those who are essentially centralists, people like Milutin or Larin or Nagin, people we sometimes call right-wing Bolsheviks, but they were really quite intelligent people when it came to thinking about economic matters. And Lenin, and then the factory committees, and then a little bit later left communists. One sees a very large range of division and disagreement on what the transition to socialism, let's call it, should look like. And much of the debate is very technical, and you'll be relieved that I'm not going to go into it, but it concerns things like different drafts of first of all, the decree on workers' control, and then on practical instructions for its realization. And putting it in a very, very crude way, one could say that against the people who had been most vocal, say, at the Sixth Party Congress in August 1917, the centralizers, the people who believed that you could only resolve the economic crisis through statewide measures of regulation, and that one should use the existing organs of regulation, which had been set up in 1915, which were democratized after February, and existed in a very, very substantial way. They were regulating food, they were trying to regulate fuel, etc., etc. That these were organs that could be taken and used by the incoming Bolshevik or Bolshevik left SR administration. That was one pole. Lenin I'll talk about in a moment. But at another pole, we have the factory committees, who were absolutely, as Goody had said, convinced centralizers. They too believed that the economy could only be run in a centralized way, but they looked to the central organ that emerges in beginning of December 1917, the Supreme Council of National Economy, a new organ that breaks with the existing organs of regulation. They looked to that as a body that should be responding to decision-making that comes from lower levels of the Soviet factory committee and trade union hierarchy. And they stand for what's sometimes called active workers' control. They believe and realize their aim of making the decisions of the control commissions, as they became known after October, binding on employers. And Lenin is an interesting position, and I haven't changed my view on this because one still reads commonly that Lenin basically believed in some kind of what he called state capitalism by the time he wrote the Immediate Tasks of Soviet Power in March 1918, where he calls for some kind of cooperation between capital and the new state. Dear, oh dear. But actually, Lenin, I think, in the excitement of October, in his terrific kind of irritation with the so-called right of the party, who had been insistent on trying to form a homogeneous coalition government of all the socialist parties. He, I think, goes through a period of real utopianism in which he celebrates what he calls the Red Guard attack on capital. And this, in effect, was kind of a spontaneous movement on the part of factory committees to nationalise, or as they put it, nationalise from below, factories where the employer, the owner, had either abandoned the enterprise or where they felt he was guilty of actual sabotage. And so, although these factory committees didn't try and take over in the sense of control in an anarcho-syndicalist fashion, they did find themselves trying to run factories in desperate conditions, and they put great pressure on the emergent Sovnarkhoz, the emergent council, Supreme Council of National Economy, to take over their factories. In other words, to take responsibility for financing, for finding raw materials, and so on. The problem, and I won't dwell on that, is that as an industrial city heavily dependent on production for the war, even had there not been an increasingly catastrophic economic crisis, there would have been massive demobilization of the war industries. And although there was some talk about trying to adapt war industry for civilian consumption production, the times were so cruel that this really remained a kind of fanciful idea on paper. But Lenin, in this period, I think, is supporting factory committees, even though quite quickly, as things go from bad to worse, by March 1918, he is seriously reviewing his position and arguing for some kind of cooperation with capital. The story's a little bit more complicated than I'm making it, but I'll leave it without sort of nuance for the moment. The point is that by March and especially April 1918, when this policy of state capitalism is enunciated, the capitalists have long since either been expropriated, and Lenin saw the Red Guard attack on capitalism as being about expropriation of capitalists. They'd either been expropriated or they'd fled with their assets to southern Russia or abroad. In some industries, they did stay, especially in textiles, and later they do become involved in some of the regional organs of the Supreme Council of National Economy. But I think there is a kind of way in which Lenin, for a time, is responding to this idea that there has to be some realization of genuine workers' power within this system of control. But by March, April 1918, he's moved to what becomes essentially the position that he had arguably always had, but certainly retained to the end of his life. And that was the idea that the crying need in Russia was to raise labour productivity. And if this meant, and use the term, dictatorial methods in the workplace, if it meant Taylorism, if it meant restoring one-person management, if it meant increasing the pay of technicians and engineers, this was what mattered. And I came to a sort of slightly nuanced libertarian conclusion, which was nuanced in the sense that I don't think that the factory committee program could have worked given the terrible conditions that prevailed at the time. But the fact that it was forgotten so quickly, the fact that ideas about trying to realize some genuine workers' power in the workplace, the fact that that idea really was quite quickly swept under the carpet, seemed to me to be one of the reasons why, in the longer term, workers' power in Russia was curtailed. I'm going to stop there. I did have a sort of conclusion, which was some sort of reflections on the relevance of all this to today, but I think I'd rather hear what you've got to say, and we can discuss, if necessary, some of my own ideas later. But anyway, thank you.